Some debts are paid with money. Others are paid with a life you never agreed to give. The rain in Newark, New Jersey, that night did not fall like a storm, but like something patient, as if the sky had been waiting to empty itself over the city for hours. Streetlights blurred into pale halos across wet pavement, and the sound of passing cars felt distant, almost detached from the narrow apartment building where Emily Carter stood barefoot on cold linoleum, listening to silence that felt heavier than any noise. Inside the small living room behind her, a woman sat with her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had lost color. Linda Carter had not slept in 2 nights. Bills were spread across the table like evidence of a life slowly collapsing under its own weight. Every envelope carried the same language: overdue, final notice, account closed. There was no anger in her face anymore, only exhaustion shaped into something that resembled acceptance. Emily was 19, but that night she felt older than the room itself, as if time had folded unevenly around her shoulders. She had stopped asking questions an hour ago, not because she understood, but because she had learned that some answers arrive whether you are ready or not. When the knock came, it was not loud. It was measured, almost polite, like someone who already knew they would be let in. Linda stood first, walking to the door with a hesitation that did not belong to her body but to her decision. When she opened it, 2 men stood outside in dark coats, their expressions unreadable, not aggressive, not kind, simply final in a way that suggested conversation had already ended elsewhere. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. One of them spoke a name, not Emily's, not Linda's, but someone neither of them had ever seen, a name tied to a debt that had grown quietly in the background of their lives until it became large enough to fill the room. Emily watched from behind her mother as the words settled into the air like dust refusing to move. There was no negotiation, only a pause where understanding should have been. Linda's eyes shifted once toward her daughter, and in that single moment, something passed between them that did not require explanation. It was not anger or betrayal in its purest form, but something more distant, like surrender shaped by years of trying and failing to stand upright against invisible pressure. The men stepped aside slightly, allowing space for what came next, as if this part of the night had been scheduled in advance. Emily did not move when her mother turned back to her. She only watched, still, as if stillness itself might delay whatever decision was about to be spoken aloud. The room felt smaller than it had ever been, as though the walls had leaned in to listen. And in that narrowing silence, Linda Carter finally said the words that would change the shape of everything that followed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the calm of someone who had already crossed the line long before speaking it. The silence that followed did not end when the words were spoken. It stayed in the room like something physical, pressing gently but constantly against the air Emily Carter breathed. Linda Carter did not look away from her daughter, but she also did not move toward her. It was as if the distance between them had already been measured and accepted long before that moment arrived. Outside the thin apartment walls, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, passing cars reflecting broken streaks of light across the ceiling like reminders that life elsewhere had not paused for what had just been decided inside this small space. Emily did not fully understand the shape of what had been agreed upon, only that it carried the weight of permanence, something that could not be argued with or undone by emotion alone. When the men in dark coats finally stepped back into the hallway, their presence left with them a sense of pressure that did not immediately disappear. One of them left a small envelope on the table before closing the door behind him, and the sound of the latch clicking shut felt louder than anything else that night. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Linda slowly exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath for longer than she could remember. Emily's eyes shifted toward the envelope, but did not reach for it. The room felt unfamiliar now, as though it no longer belonged to either of them. Hours later, long after the lights outside had softened into a steady glow of distant traffic, Emily found herself sitting by the window, watching rain trace thin lines down the glass. She tried to find anger, but what came instead was confusion shaped into stillness. She had spent her life believing that decisions were made in moments of clarity, but this felt different, like something had been eroding slowly in the background long before she was aware of it. Linda remained at the kitchen table, her hands now resting flat, no longer clenched. There was a heaviness in her posture that suggested not relief, but the absence of remaining options. The envelope stayed unopened between them, a quiet object that seemed to define the space more than any words ever could. Neither reached for it. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, then softened again, as if the night itself was uncertain how to proceed. Emily finally spoke, not asking a question, not demanding explanation, but simply acknowledging the shape of what she could feel, but not yet fully name. Linda did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried none of the earlier tension, only a tired honesty that no longer attempted to soften what could not be softened. She said nothing about hope, nothing about escape, only about survival, and the cost that sometimes arrives disguised as necessity. Emily turned back toward the window, watching her reflection overlap with the blurred lights outside, and for the first time, she understood that what had begun tonight was not an event but a transition, something that would continue moving even after silence returned to the room. The morning arrived without clarity, only a slow gray light pressing through the thin apartment curtains, as if the sky itself had not fully decided what kind of day it was willing to become. Emily Carter had not slept. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands resting loosely in her lap, staring at the floor where shadows shifted slightly with every passing car outside. The envelope from the night before still lay untouched on the kitchen table, its presence unchanged, but its meaning growing heavier with each hour of silence. In the next room, Linda Carter moved slowly. Preparing coffee, she did not seem interested in drinking. The sound of the kettle clicking off echoed through the apartment like a signal that routine still existed, even when everything else felt suspended. When Emily finally stood, it was not out of decision, but out of the inability to remain still any longer. She walked to the kitchen without speaking, and Linda glanced at her only briefly before returning her focus to the cup in her hands. There was no urgency between them now, only a shared awareness that something irreversible had already been set in motion. Emily looked at the envelope for a long moment before finally sitting down across from her mother. The air between them felt thinner in daylight, as if the night had compressed everything that needed to be said into a shape neither of them had been prepared to hold. Linda did not offer explanation again. Whatever had been spoken before the dawn was the only explanation she seemed capable of giving. Instead, she reached across the table and gently pushed the envelope forward, not toward Emily's hands, but just within reach, as though acknowledging that ownership of what came next could no longer belong to her alone. Emily did not open it immediately. Her fingers hovered above it, then withdrew slightly, as if touch itself might confirm something she was not ready to accept. Outside, the city had begun to wake, distant engines and footsteps layering into a rhythm that felt disconnected from the stillness inside the apartment. After several seconds, Emily finally broke the silence, her voice steady but low, asking nothing specific, only trying to understand the shape of the choice that had been made without her. Linda's response came after a pause long enough to suggest that she had already considered every possible version of the answer. She spoke without raising her voice, without defense, only stating that sometimes decisions are not chosen so much as they are endured, that survival can slowly narrow a person's world until only one path remains visible. Emily listened without interrupting, her gaze fixed somewhere between the table and the window, where morning light now carried a different weight than the night before. She thought about how quickly a life could change without moving physically from its place, how the boundaries of safety and loss could shift without warning or permission. The envelope remained closed, but its presence now felt less like an object and more like a threshold. Linda stood eventually and moved toward the sink, rinsing her cup with deliberate slowness, as if normal actions could still create order. Emily remained seated, her hands now resting lightly on the edge of the table, aware that nothing about the room would return to what it had been before, even if everything appeared unchanged on the surface. And in that quiet morning light, both mother and daughter understood without speaking that what lay ahead was no longer a question of if something would happen, but only when it would begin. By the time the sun had fully risen, the apartment no longer felt like a place of rest, but like a space waiting for instruction. Emily Carter stood near the window again, watching the street below where people moved with a sense of direction that felt foreign to her. Everything outside continued as if nothing had shifted, Yet inside her awareness, something had already changed its shape. Linda Carter remained in the kitchen, moving between small tasks that no longer carried meaning beyond their physical motion. The sound of water running, the faint clink of a cup being set down, the soft opening and closing of a cabinet, all of it created a rhythm that tried to imitate normality but never fully reached it. The envelope still rested on the table, its edges slightly curled now from hours of silence, as if even paper could absorb tension over time. Emily finally approached it again, slower than before, and this time she did not stop her hand from making contact. The paper felt ordinary, almost disappointingly so, given the weight it seemed to carry in the room. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she looked across at her mother, searching for something unspoken, but Linda avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the counter as though attention itself might anchor her. The moment stretched until Emily finally broke it, sliding her finger under the flap and opening it with careful hesitation. Inside was not chaos, not threat, not anything she had imagined in fragments throughout the night, but instead a set of documents arranged with deliberate order, each page structured in a way that suggested procedure rather than emotion. There were names, numbers, and conditions written in a formal tone that stripped human consequence into administrative language. Emily read without fully absorbing at first, her eyes moving across lines that felt increasingly distant from the reality of her own body. Linda finally spoke again, not turning around, her voice quieter than before, explaining that there had been no negotiation in the way people often imagined, only arrangements made under pressure that left little room for alternatives. She did not justify it, nor did she defend it. She simply described it as something that had already passed the point of reversal before Emily had even known it existed. Emily lowered the papers slightly, her attention shifting not to anger, but to the strange calm that sometimes arrives when shock begins to settle into understanding. She noticed small details then, the way her mother's shoulders remained tense even while performing simple tasks, the way her movements avoided stillness as if stillness itself might invite consequences. Outside, the morning light had grown stronger, filling the apartment with a pale clarity that made everything feel more defined but not more certain. Emily sat down again, holding the documents loosely, no longer reading every line, but instead absorbing the structure of what they represented. It was not a single decision she was confronting, but the accumulation of decisions made without her presence in the room. Linda finally turned, leaning lightly against the counter, and for the first time that morning, she met her daughter's eyes without looking away. There was no apology in her expression, only exhaustion shaped into something that resembled endurance. And in that shared silence, both of them understood that whatever path lay ahead had already begun moving, not because it was chosen in that moment, but because it had been set in motion long before either of them were awake enough to stop it. The afternoon arrived without announcement, slipping into the apartment through thin curtains and settling across every surface with a quiet persistence that made time feel heavier rather than clearer. Emily Carter remained seated at the kitchen table long after she had finished reading the documents, her hands resting loosely near the edge as if still unsure whether to let go of what she had been holding. The pages were placed neatly in front of her now, aligned almost carefully, not by intention but by the instinct to restore order in a space that no longer responded to it. Across from her, Linda Carter stood near the sink again, though nothing in her posture suggested urgency. She had stopped moving between tasks and instead simply existed in small pauses, as if conserving energy for something that had not yet arrived. The apartment felt smaller than it had in the morning, not physically, but in the way silence began to occupy corners more completely than sound ever could. Emily finally spoke, her voice low and steady, not asking for explanation this time, but for understanding that could not be found in documents or structure. Linda turned slowly, as though the question itself required distance before it could be acknowledged. When she answered, there was no attempt to soften the truth. She spoke of time, of pressure, of choices made gradually rather than suddenly, each step smaller than the last until the direction became unavoidable. Emily listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere between her mother and the window, as if trying to locate where decisions begin when no one is watching them form. Outside, the city continued its indifferent movement, sunlight shifting across parked cars and pavement, life continuing without reference to the stillness inside the room. Emily reached for the documents again, not to read them, but to confirm their presence, as if repetition might eventually make them feel less distant. The language remained unchanged, formal and precise, yet each line now carried a different weight, not because the words had changed, but because she had. Linda eventually sat down across from her, placing her hands flat on the table, no longer hiding fatigue behind movement. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence there was no longer confusion, only recognition that whatever had been unfolding could no longer be approached as something reversible. Emily looked up at her mother then, not with accusation, but with the quiet realization that understanding and acceptance were no longer the same thing. Linda met her gaze without flinching, and in that exchange there was no resolution, only the shared awareness that both of them were now standing inside the consequences of a decision that had already been made long before either of them had the language to question it. The evening light had begun to fade again by the time the apartment shifted into a quieter kind of stillness, one that did not feel like rest, but like anticipation stretched across time. Emily Carter remained seated at the kitchen table, though the documents in front of her no longer felt like objects she was actively reading. They had become part of the space itself, as permanent as the walls, as unavoidable as the air. Linda Carter stood near the window now, her reflection faint against the glass, watching the street below with an expression that suggested she was waiting for something she already knew was approaching. Neither of them had spoken for a long stretch of time, not because there was nothing left to say, but because language no longer seemed capable of changing what had been set in motion. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the apartment door arrived softly at first, almost indistinguishable from the building's natural creaks, but then grew more deliberate, more intentional, until even silence inside the room seemed to recognize it. Emily noticed it first, not as fear, but as a shift in pressure, like the atmosphere itself had adjusted to accommodate an unseen presence. Linda turned away from the window slowly, her posture tightening in a way that suggested recognition rather than surprise. The knock that followed was not loud, but it carried certainty, the kind that does not ask permission twice. Emily looked toward the door, then back at her mother, searching for confirmation she already suspected would not come in words. Linda nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since the night had begun, her composure carried something closer to resignation than exhaustion. The room felt smaller again as the handle turned. When the door opened, the hallway light spilled across the threshold, and a man stood there without urgency, as if time itself had adjusted to his schedule rather than the other way around. Vincent Moretti did not immediately enter. He simply observed the space, his attention moving from the room to the table, then briefly to Emily, who remained seated but no longer entirely still. There was no expression of aggression, no visible impatience, only a controlled stillness that made every movement around him feel slightly delayed. Linda stepped forward first, not as defense, but as acknowledgement of arrival. She did not speak at once, and neither did he. The silence between them carried the weight of prior understanding, as though this moment had already been negotiated somewhere outside of this room and outside of this night. Emily stood slowly, uncertain whether remaining seated would feel like defiance or ignorance, and found herself now fully aware of how the space had changed simply because someone new had entered it. Vincent finally stepped inside, closing the door behind him with careful ease, and for a brief moment, the apartment seemed to hold its breath. He looked at Emily again, this time more directly, not evaluating her as an object or a condition, but as something unexpectedly present within a situation that had likely been described to him in simpler terms. Linda gestured faintly toward the table, toward the documents, though no explanation followed. It was unnecessary. The paper had already spoken in a language that required no translation. Vincent's attention shifted to them, then returned to Emily, and in that brief exchange there was no judgment, only recognition of reality as it stood in that exact moment. The silence stretched again, not uncomfortable, but dense, as if every possible version of conversation was being held back simultaneously. Outside, the city continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the small, contained stillness forming inside the apartment, where nothing had been resolved yet, but everything had already begun to change shape simply because all participants were now in the same room. Vincent Moretti remained standing near the center of the room, not claiming space, but naturally occupying it as if the apartment had adjusted its geometry around his presence. The silence that followed his entrance did not feel like emptiness anymore, but like containment, as though every word that might have been spoken had been temporarily placed behind glass. Emily Carter stood near the edge of the kitchen table, her posture steady but cautious, her attention divided between the documents and the man now observing them. Linda Carter had not moved since he entered, her position near the window unchanged, though her reflection in the glass now appeared more distant, as if she were watching the scene from slightly outside herself. Vincent's gaze moved once more toward the papers on the table, then returned to Linda, not with curiosity, but with a kind of measured acknowledgement that suggested prior understanding of what those pages represented. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, neither raised nor softened, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to decisions being accepted without debate. He did not ask for confirmation of details already visible in the room. Instead, he addressed the situation as something already acknowledged, referring to conditions, timing, and obligations with the precision of someone reviewing an arrangement that had already been interpreted elsewhere. Emily listened without interrupting, her eyes shifting subtly between him and her mother, trying to understand whether what she was hearing belonged to negotiation or confirmation. Linda finally turned away from the window, stepping closer to the table, her movements slow but deliberate, as if crossing an invisible line that had been waiting for her all night. She did not challenge his words. Instead, she responded in a way that suggested acceptance of structure rather than agreement with outcome. Vincent's attention remained steady, but there was a change in how he observed Emily, no longer as an abstraction within a problem, but as a person now physically present within its boundaries. For a moment, the apartment felt suspended between definitions, no longer fully belonging to either the night before or the morning that had already passed. Emily finally spoke, her voice controlled but carrying a strain that had not been present before. She did not ask for reversal, nor did she ask for justification. Her question was simpler, directed not at power or process, but at intention. The room seemed to tighten slightly around that question, as if even the air was aware that something more fundamental was being tested. Vincent did not answer immediately. His silence was not avoidance but calculation, a pause that extended just long enough to make clear that the answer was not automatic. When he finally responded, his words did not dismantle the structure already described, but instead reframed it in a way that introduced a different possibility within it, not of ownership, not of control, but of reconsideration. Linda's expression shifted subtly at that, not in relief, but in recognition that the situation was no longer fixed in the way it had been assumed to be. Emily remained still, absorbing the implications without fully allowing them to settle into certainty. Outside the apartment, the city continued its uninterrupted rhythm, unaware of the quiet redefinition taking place within these walls. And in that moment, with all three of them standing within the same confined space of unresolved understanding, it became clear that nothing about what had brought them together would remain exactly as it had been defined before this conversation began. The apartment no longer felt like a space defined by walls, but like a narrow stage where every silence carried meaning that could not be avoided. Vincent Moretti stood slightly apart from the kitchen table now, his attention moving between Emily Carter, Linda Carter, and the documents that remained the quiet center of everything in the room. There was no urgency in his posture, only a controlled stillness that made time feel slower whenever he spoke, or even when he simply observed. Emily remained standing, her hands loosely at her sides, though her focus shifted between the man in front of her and the realization that the situation around her was no longer something external, but something she was now fully inside. Linda Carter sat down again, not out of surrender, but from the exhaustion of sustained tension that had finally reached its limit. The earlier structure of conversation had changed, no longer rigid or purely transactional, but something closer to reconsideration, as if the boundaries of what had been assumed were quietly being redrawn in real time. Vincent spoke again, this time more measured, clarifying that what had been described previously did not need to remain in its original form, that circumstances could be adjusted if conditions were acknowledged with honesty rather than assumption. His tone carried neither persuasion nor insistence, only the presence of someone accustomed to outcomes shifting when reality was fully understood. Emily listened carefully, her expression steady but no longer distant, as if something inside her was beginning to differentiate between what had been decided for her and what might still be influenced. Linda looked down at her hands, then briefly toward her daughter, and in that small movement there was something that resembled both regret and recognition at once. The documents on the table no longer felt like fixed outcomes, but like representations of a moment that might still be interpreted differently depending on what followed. The room itself seemed quieter, not because sound had diminished, but because attention had become more focused, as if even the air was waiting for a direction to be chosen. Vincent finally stepped slightly closer to the table, not taking control of it, but acknowledging it as the center of what still needed to be resolved. He explained in simple terms that obligations created under pressure could sometimes be re-examined when intent and consequence were no longer aligned, and that not every arrangement had to continue simply because it had been initiated. Emily's eyes remained on him longer this time, not searching for contradiction, but for clarity within the unexpected shift in tone. Linda's posture eased slightly, though not into relief, more into cautious attention, as if she understood that what was being offered was not resolution, but the possibility of a different direction that had not been visible before. The city outside continued without interruption, headlights passing across the window in steady rhythm, indifferent to the small recalibration occurring within the apartment. And within that contained space, where nothing had been finalized but everything had been reconsidered, all three of them remained present in a silence that no longer felt like conclusion, but like the uncertain beginning of something still taking shape. The room remained still in a way that no longer felt tense, but suspended, as if even time itself was waiting for the final shape of what this moment would become. Emily Carter stood near the kitchen table, her gaze no longer fixed on the documents, but on the man who had quietly shifted the direction of everything said before. Linda Carter sat slightly forward now, her hands resting on the edge of the table, no longer clenched, but still marked by the weight of everything that had brought them here. Vincent Moretti remained calm, his presence steady, but the earlier rigidity in the room had softened into something closer to clarity, as if the structure of the situation had been examined and found no longer absolute. When he spoke again, his words carried a different tone, not of adjustment alone, but of final recognition that certain arrangements should never continue simply because they had been set in motion. He stated it plainly, without embellishment, that obligations born under pressure do not always define what must remain true, and that correction is sometimes not an exception but a necessity when understanding finally catches up to circumstance. Emily listened carefully, her expression shifting for the first time from uncertainty into something quieter, more grounded, as if she was beginning to understand not only what had been decided around her, but what was now being undone. Linda lowered her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried no defense, only acknowledgement of the path that had led here and the limits of what she believed she had been able to control. Vincent turned slightly toward the table, then back to both of them, and made a decision that did not feel like negotiation but like closure. He confirmed that whatever arrangement had been implied or assumed would not proceed, and that no further obligation would be expected or enforced. The words settled into the room without resistance, not because they were simple, but because they were final in a way that required no further interpretation. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she absorbed the silence that followed, noticing how different it felt from the silences of the previous night and morning. This silence did not press or confine, it released. Linda exhaled slowly, not in relief exactly, but in the recognition that something irreversible had been lifted without requiring anything in return. Vincent stepped back slightly, as if ensuring that distance itself confirmed the resolution. There was no celebration, no emotional declaration, only the quiet completion of something that had once carried weight but no longer needed to. Emily finally looked at her mother, and in that exchange there was no sudden forgiveness or rewriting of what had occurred, only the shared understanding that they were no longer standing inside the same kind of uncertainty that had defined them hours before. Linda nodded faintly, not asking for reconciliation, but acknowledging survival. Vincent offered one final observation, not as instruction, but as principle, stating that choices made under pressure often reveal more about circumstance than about people, and that not every situation deserves to define the lives it touches. He then moved toward the door, pausing only briefly before leaving. His departure as unceremonious as his arrival had been, yet entirely definitive in its effect. The door closed without emphasis, and the apartment did not immediately change, but something within it had settled into a different state. Emily remained standing for a moment, then slowly sat down, not because she was exhausted, but because stillness no longer felt like confinement. Linda stayed where she was, watching her daughter with an expression that no longer carried urgency or fear, only presence. Outside, the city continued its steady rhythm, unchanged and unaware, but inside the apartment, the air had shifted into something lighter, not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer dictated the shape of what came next.